So this is the second page that Shanaz and I would discuss with our banks, which was, a very rudimentary type risk proxies. We have the activity risk on one axis and the KYC demographic risk on the other. And I like to use the metaphor of a rowboat. You have two oars. You have your activity oar and your KYC oar. And you have to use both oars in tandem, or you're going to go in circles if you overemphasize one oar or the other. And it's very, very easy, and we'll talk about this throughout this group of seminars, to basically map them on a chart like this, and you get to increasing risk as you go up to the upper right-hand corner until you get to the point where it's an unacceptable risk. And then the other thing is, it doesn't have to be two-dimensional. Once you start doing this type of thing, what you do is you start layering these types of axes on top of each other, and you start getting 3, 4, 5-dimensional type views. But in all cases, it's decision-centric. It gets down to the question, who do you bank, who don't you bank, and how do you tell the difference? And this is one of the most important ways of telling the difference, is mapping out the activity.
I have a question here, Tom. Do you feel that, because I'm based in Bangladesh and countries like Bangladesh where, the market is pretty homogeneous, right? How do you really how do you really distinguish customers with, all the decision that is required to be made? Because it's difficult to, identify and distinguish.
Well, first of all, I go back to the who do you bank, who don't you bank, and how do you tell the difference? So Bangladesh, would be very much like a lot of other developing economies.
Sure.
You would have different types of banks. You would have some banks that would be primarily retail, and they would generally have, highly distributed type activity. And you would have no single customer of theirs that would have undue risk. You would also, within any market, you would have maybe a larger bank that might be more sophisticated, but it might also have higher risk customers, take in terms of the ones that are handling the government accounts. If they have state-owned enterprises, it makes sense that the larger banks would have those kind of accounts. But on the other hand, they have a higher political risk, grand corruption risk, so to speak. So you have to look at that differently, and you have to understand, how they do it. I remember I was trying to figure out how to deal with corruption in Africa, and we had a visit with our South African customers down there, and they had a risk appetite, into quite a bit of sub-Saharan Africa that we did not have. But I wanted to learn from them, and I said, how do you bank in those countries? And they were actually quite thoughtful. They said, well, a lot depends on what kind of customer they are. They said, if we have a customer in South Africa that's selling a tractor into a higher risk country, that's pretty easy for us to look at, because we know a tractor, we know what it's worth. We can understand that. If, on the other hand, we have money coming out of the country for, say, natural resources or whatever, or maybe an infrastructure project, that's much higher risk. And there's certain countries that we won't deal with that. Or if we do deal with it, we deal with it more as a project finance type thing, which is we get a statement of what the project is, what they expect the expenditures of the money is, who's the counterparties, and that sort of thing.
Right.
And then they track all of that the same way they would track a development loan. But a lot of the banks said that they wouldn't deal with it. If you're dealing with individuals and small enterprises, the risk to, say, a large correspondent bank is relatively low, because yes, every individual or small business could be corrupt, but it's not going to be the type of corruption that would be existential. You take the 1MDB case and the amount of money they're dealing with, that's existential, not only for the local banks, but presumably ultimately even up to the correspondent bank level. So
Sure.
the whole likelihood and severity of the risk is, what is the risk of this kind of customer base?
Mm,
And
absolutely.
go back to what I was saying with Central America. Yes, there's a lot of cartels in Central America, but for the most part, they weren't using the local banking sector. They were completely outside the banking sector. The activity we were seeing go through us was very moderate or low risk.
How interesting.
And to the credit of our regulators, I remember showing them all of these different maps or whatever. We got 20 minutes into the conversation. He said, "Tom, I get it. I understand. This is a pretty low risk customer base." It was the last we talked about those banks, as long as we kept looking for the outliers.
Right.
There's also a real benefit as far as financial inclusion.
Oh,
If,
yes.
if
Yeah.
you can establish that it's real people doing real things transparently, you're
Mm,
also leveraging on the financial inclusion. And
absolutely.
virtually every bank wants to be financially inclusive.
Yeah, absolutely. So tell us about this. Looks really creative way of showing
So
risk.
this is just I'd say more of a template for how you actually would take different things. And when we're doing all of these case studies, we will take this approach, because you'll do different types of risk proxies for different types of customer type. But you have, your risk proxy 1 and your risk proxy 2. You try to get something that truly is a proxy for risk, from a bank's perspective. And if you're in the lower left-hand corner, that's the benign. You want to have as much of your activity and customer base there as possible. Then as you start moving out on it, you're always going to have outliers. The way that we normally do it is we look at those outliers, we record the information so that we don't have to redo it every time. And as long as we're comfortable with it and they're staying within parameters, we understand those outliers, and maybe we'll relook at them every once in a while. And then you have your people in the upper right-hand corner, which are your truly high-risk customers, or if you're a correspondent, it would be a customer of a customer. And those are the ones where you need to have, at some point, you need to have a risk baseline. You said, look, I can't tell enough about this customer to be able to vouch for them. And I'm not going to jeopardize the rest of my customer base to hang
Mm,
on to this customer. And the banks that just make that kind of decision early on are the ones that service their customer base the best. The irony is the banks that are the best banks to deal with are the ones that just bank the real people doing real things transparently. They're doing their overall customer base a huge favor. And what we used to say was, compliance for them was a competitive advantage. If
right.
they had a defined risk appetite and they weren't dealing with the high risk customers, all of their other customers benefited from that, because those customers could have their activity go through the international financial system with minimal interruption and minimal cost.
So true. So true. It's an added advantage.
So it used to be, and Shanaz probably remembers this from some of the early seminars we did. It used to be that I used a metaphor that AML was like looking for needles in a world of haystacks. The needle being the AML, or the money laundering, haystacks being product haystacks or geography haystacks, or whatever. And then you were trying to find them. Uh, as we got more and more technology based, I moved away from haystacks and started using the computer metaphor. And a really thoughtful program, a wisdom program on the DIKW is looking at the whole computer screen. They're looking at their customer base, and they're trying to figure out who are my problem customers, who are my benign customers. The program that is mired in the data and the noise are spending all their time on individual pixels, on checklist and that sort of thing. And if you're focused on things at the pixel level and you're not putting it into context, you're going to miss the picture. And it's you just step back and use your overall customer base to put everything in perspective. And what we'll see when we go through the 1MDB case is anyone that just would have used the portfolio approach actually would have seen the problem right away. In fact, to be honest, they did see the problem right away. It was only when they got down to the individual pixels and started getting away from just common sense or a sense of purpose that they got into real trouble.
Right. Such a creative way of showing this, Tom. I must say, this is really creative.
So this is, the theme of the entire course, which is purpose, not pageantry. And the pageantry is where you're just doing something for show. You're just doing something so that if something goes wrong, you've got an excuse. You're just doing something because a regulator gave a manual and said you should do this thing. Purpose is, I really don't want large-scale corruption money going through me. I don't want terrorist money going through me. And you have people that are saying, I don't want it, and I'm going to do what I can, a reasonable amount of effort to keep it. And I remember once I was in Russia doing a seminar. We were at a central bank, I think in Samara or Kazan. And, we were talking about all the different stuff, and they were talking about the kind of the pixel approach or whatever. And I asked them, I said, are there any chess players here in the audience? And, they looked, and I think virtually everyone there was a chess player. And I said, if I was you, what I would do is I'd take your very best chess player and I'd give them all the data that you give the regulators and just tell them the money launderer is your opponent on the chessboard. Just beat them. And it gets down to that. You don't have to be perfect, you just have to make sure that you don't have a Jolo that is stealing billions of dollars that are going through your bank.
Exactly. I have one observation that you see all the good institutions, good banks, they were exposed in this whole mess. I mean, Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, or other bigger organizations. So I feel that, these scams or the scammers, they design engaging the bigger, good, reputed organizations. Has that been the case for the other bigger cases in the field of money laundering?
I guess you always have to be a little careful about generalizing, but I would say, yeah. And I would go one step further. For me, the easiest way to handle particularly banks in a developing market, but we did this with our domestic US correspondent banks as well. Retail banks that have individuals and very small and medium-sized enterprise are pretty easy to underwrite from an AML perspective, because they have highly distributed activity, highly distributed customer base that has a very predictable type pattern.
Sure.
And to the extent that you have the outliers, which you always will, you'll have some individual that wants to buy an expensive house. You'll have someone who's got, a relative in a different country or whatever. Even those kind of outliers have predictable patterns that you can find a pedigree to it. It's the ones that are very large and have customers that are very non-transparent that become a problem. So ironically, if you were to say what's the biggest risk of money laundering in the United States, it would be for the most part, are larger banks. Now,
Mhm.
there's examples where you have, smaller banks, say in South Florida or along the Southwest border, or some other areas that have very specific risk that you have to watch for. But yes, the large banks that have, the larger customers, have the less opaque activity, uh, are much riskier.
Right,
Now,
right.
presumably, they have some controls, that will balance out that risk. But those controls are only as good as their sense of purpose,
Yeah,
which gets
absolutely.
to who do you bank, who don't you bank, and how do you tell the difference?